mai e ngā mana e ngā reo ki tēnei pāhotanga motuhake o tira ki tēnei kaupapa nui whakaharahara e mōhiotia nei ko APEC CEO Summit 2021. Welcome back everyone. Our next session is titled Looking to the Future and we're going to hear from another inspiring group of people, aren't we?
Ka nui taku tautoko I te rā kōrero. That's right. Over the past 2 days, we have spoken a lot about future opportunities and challenges for the Asia-Pacific region. But of course, it is impossible to think about the future without considering the next generation. It is important our leaders listen to younger voices and that young people have the confidence to make change in areas they are passionate about.
For more on this, it is our pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Jerome Foster. Jerome spent 58 weeks campaigning for the climate outside the White House before being appointed to President Biden's Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Aged just 19, Julian, 19. This makes him the youngest ever White House advisor. Jerome is also the founder of youth media outlet, The Climate Reporter, and the executive director of youth voting advocacy group 1 Million of Us, which educates and mobilises young people, rangatahi, to register and turn out to vote. Nō reira e te iwi, whakanui a tā tātou tangata o te wā, please welcome Jerome Foster in conversation with New Zealand business consultant and journalist Tim McCready.
Jerome, it is a real pleasure to be speaking with you today. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us at the APEC CEO Summit. I want to begin with your protest outside the White House. You spent 58 weeks on your school strike for climate every Friday, rain or shine. What was it that got you so passionate about the environment and indeed climate change?
Yeah, so when we talk about why there was such a massive movement around climate striking that seemed to have emerged out of the blue, it was really a growing concern around my generation that elected officials specifically would not really look out for our future because there had been decades for opportunity, but there was no real tangible action that we saw. I think that was the real motivator, is young people saying, hey, this isn't a niche issue. This is actually a generation-wide anxiety that we're feeling. And if we want them to take us seriously, then we have to mass mobilize. And the youth climate movement had been around, each in this case of the United States, for about a few years before then. And we had been trying to figure out how do we continue to make our voices heard. And as the climate strikes came around, we were saying this is the medium where we can finally show the scale of concern while also backing it up with policy demands like the Green New Deal, like the passage of Justice 40 and so many other policies that we needed to see at the time. So that was the motivator behind why we did it and why we're continuing to push even in other ways beyond climate striking.
Through that strike for climate, you sacrificed your education for the environment. How supportive were your peers and your teachers of you during that time?
It was a mixed bag of who supported me and didn't. My principal was definitely behind it, and a few of my specific teachers were my computer science teacher, but it was a mixed bag on what their opinion was on the climate crisis. I think no matter what, it was a decision of studying for a future that is going to continue to be stabilized and going to continue to be destroyed isn't something that I want to spend my time doing. Say we spend time studying for a future that will not exist. What is the purpose of that? So it was, no matter if I face immediate hardship at my school, I know that me fighting for my future is going to have longstanding positive impact because that will be a larger system scale solution that we have. So that was kind of my thought process behind if someone supported me or didn't.
I'd like to know what those teachers think now that you've made that remarkable journey from outside the White House to inside. You've been appointed onto President Biden's Environmental Justice Advisory Council. What do you hope to achieve with a seat at that table?
Yeah, so recently I have been appointed to the Biden administration's White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and I'm the youngest member on that council. So my perspective is a bit different on how do we transition to a safe climate system. And the reason why I've been appointed is kind of my history in politics and kind of balancing my activism work with also advocacy. So throughout my 9th and 10th grade year, I had also worked at the DC State Board of Education. And also throughout my 11th grade year, I had an internship with the Honorable Congressman John Lewis. And from that experience, I wanted to figure out how we can continue to mobilize young people. So I started an organization called 1 Million of Us, that mobilized 1 million young people across the United States to turn out to vote in the presidential election. And from that context, that those demands from over the years of working in advocacy translate directly into the work that I'm doing now at the White House. With regard to the Justice 40 initiative, where basically we're taking a whole government approach to deal with climate justice. And a lot of that is, how do we make sure that climate education is in our schools and is a core subject that we're teaching students to live sustainably from their inception of how they live their lives. And secondly is, how do we make sure that we aren't continuing to give away subsidies to the fossil fuel industry? When we want to talk about free markets, we have to make it fair for renewable energy to compete with fossil fuel industry, because right now solar and wind are cheaper, but because of so many government handouts, it doesn't seem that way on the economic side. And also another demand that we have is to phase out the construction and really to halt the construction of new fossil fuel pipelines that are continuing to go through indigenous lands and are continuing to pollute their waters. That is the main concern that I'm championing in this White House administration, to make sure that when we talk about climate justice, we're talking about the equity side and also the component of education as well.
You briefly touched on this. We know that climate change is impacting minorities, low income and Indigenous communities disproportionately compared to the rest of the population. You've spent time visiting communities in areas most impacted by the climate crisis. What kinds of things have you seen in those visits that perhaps people don't necessarily think about?
From going to communities and from having that correspondence with them and understanding the perspective of like frontline communities that are facing the climate crisis, it is such a drastically different, disproportionate impact of the climate crisis that they're feeling that it doesn't even feel like the same world that we're in. Because in the case of Louisiana, like the Lower Ninth Ward, there's another community that's right next to it that after Hurricane Katrina, they got immediate economic support. But the Lower Ninth Ward to this day has homes that aren't even rebuilt. And the only disparity that can be seen is the aspect of race and economic status. And that is really, when we get to the heart of the climate crisis, it really isn't just a crisis in itself, but it also sets a fire on every other slow rolling crisis like racism, like sexism, like migration and immigration, and makes them into catastrophic failures, like how we're going to see over 1 billion climate migrants if we don't do anything to stop the climate crisis right now. And right now we're seeing in the United States over 80% of coal-fired power plants placed in Black and brown communities. Like, consistent coincidence isn't coincidence. It's a system that continues to destabilize communities of color and Indigenous communities that continue to put us behind in our fight for equity and equality. Every time we go out in our communities and we have to breathe in toxic pollutants, that sets us back when a pandemic arises and now we have pre-existing conditions. Like, that's how these systems continue to compound on each other. And I think when we talk about climate justice, we have to think about the fact of where were these pollutants emitted, and also where's their impact being seen today. The vast majority of natural disasters are being felt in the global South, like in the continent of Africa, like in Southeast Asia, like in South America. They have been overexploited for so many generations that now, as they're facing the climate crisis, they have no other economic opportunities left because they've already been stripped of their natural resources. They've already been stripped of their independence. They've been stripped of so much that they had, that now when we want to build our communities up to be resilient from the climate crisis, they're left with nothing. And I think that is the understanding that we have to have, is that feeling of not seeing international aid to developing countries as a handout, but as a responsibility and as reconciliation for the damage that has been done over the generations that started with colonialism. Because the climate crisis didn't just start with the idea of emitting CO2 particles in the atmosphere, but the idea of limitless extraction, whether that's nature, whether that's people, whether that's communities, whether that's anything. That ideology has to end if we want to really see the climate crisis be a thing of the past.
I know a lot has been made about the fact that you're the only person aged under 40 on the advisory council. In fact, you're less than half that age. I've got to ask, how does that feel? And how important is it to have young people included in leadership, particularly in these areas?
Absolutely. I think that when we talk about like having young people at the table and like what different perspectives we have, it's like diversifying solutions. Like in the case of so many situations where we're trying to figure out how do we solve the climate crisis in different contexts, if we bring young people, if we bring Indigenous people to that table, we have different knowledge bases to tap in from. Like for us, a young person, we understand that if we want to have carbon dioxide removal, we can't just keep using the traditional methods of, oh, we're going to store it in some soil basins, because in a matter of decades, sometimes that can seep out. And only a young person would have that mindset first, because we know that we'll be inheriting that future. And if we continue to remove carbon from the atmosphere, but it seeps right back in decades later, then that'll be our future that's destroyed. Like that perspective and that nuance of how do we look at the climate crisis from varying different vantage points, then that is actually how we have the most comprehensive solutions. Like in the case of Indigenous communities in California, with the fires that are happening every single year, when they started including Indigenous people as a part of the council and as a part of consultations, they understood that Indigenous people lived alongside nature and were actively doing smaller fires, controlled fires, in ways that would actively revitalize the forest, which will prevent future forest fires. If they had never included Indigenous people in that conversation, they would never have known about those solutions. And that's some of the examples of why you should have young people and people of color in boardrooms and decision-making tables, because we bring different perspectives and different knowledge bases alongside us.
Yeah, you've made great use of technology to help get your voice heard, not just on this issue, but on things like voter turnout among youth, gun violence, racial and gender equality, among other areas. How important is technology to promote social justice movements and to inspire those in power on issues that matter?
Yes, that's a really good question. A little bit of background is that I didn't just come from a traditional kind of like activist, like I'm going to start organizing marches. I started out as a computer programmer, specifically like coding virtuality environments, and coded more virtuality environments about civic engagement. And what I really understood and what my real passion is how do we kind of break down at its core the merger between technology and nature, and make sure that we are using technology as a way to amplify what nature already naturally produces, and use nature as a way to inform technology in how it should be operating. And I think if we understand that symbiotic relationship, then we're able to have a more natural progression of a merger between science and technology, nature and technology, and not this divide that we're seeing, or a combative relationship between how nature operates and how technology operates. Specifically in the case of virtuality, it's like you're creating an entirely digital world where someone can step into that experience and see it for themselves. And the context that I used it was basically telling the story of people at the front lines of the climate crisis, and for people in developed countries like in Europe, like in America, to understand where they're coming from. Like with the migrant crisis in the United States or in Europe, people only see them as traveling over the ocean, or traveling over one border wall, or traveling from a drought-stricken community, but they don't see the human being behind that number. They don't see the human being behind that experience, and they don't know that that may be a child or a mother or a brother or a sister. And when you immerse them into that understanding or a different perspective, and they see the world that they're in, they have a different perspective and an increased compassion for their circumstances. And I think that is really what has to happen in this globalized world, is next for us, not just to be interlinked economically, but to be interlinked culturally, and to understand at a deeper level where people come from and what their cultural experiences are. And technology is the best way to demonstrate that.
On that notion of understanding where people come from, my final question, young people who will be watching this, what would you tell them if they don't think they have the ability to make change in areas they're passionate about?
Well, I think that a lot of young people have been seeing the environmental movement and have been seeing the rise of technology, and they've been like stepping in. But if there's a young person that's still out there that's listening to this message, know that you have so much potential. Like if you're interested in the environment, or interested in economics, interested in so many other areas, this is the perfect time for you to really step into that and to merge your passion with what you want to do for a living. Like it doesn't have to be two different things. It can be a merger of both. Like for me, I was passionate about technology and also environmental activism. So I pursued both and tried to find the merger between them. And I think as a young person, oftentimes it feels like you're inheriting an earth that's like completely just like it's completely just backwards. But it's now our kind of role to figure out how we're gonna to help make that better. So if you're interested in like in so many other fields, then there's so many ways you can get involved by joining a local organization, joining or getting involved with the climate strike in your community, and also just by getting involved in local advocacy work or involved in policy. Because activism is kind of pushing from the outside. We also need another force of advocacy that continues to advocate from the inside as well and champion the goals of movements. So whatever perspective you have, bring that to the table, because movements are continuing to grow and build.
I love that enthusiasm, and I'm sure many of those watching will be as inspired as I am. You've given us all a lot to be hopeful and optimistic about. Jerome, thank you so much for your time with us here today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Two inspiring young men there, Tim McCready in conversation with Jerome Foster. I'm sure Tim won't mind us saying this, but Jerome, especially impressive, just 19 years old. He is the youngest ever White House advisor, and clearly a great example of someone who has been able to use digital tools to mobilise people of his generation for the issues that they think will define their futures, which is incredibly impressive.
Yeah, I found it interesting. He said he was passionate about two things. One was technology, and the other was environmental activism, right? And he didn't just want to be an activist, that he also wanted to be an advocate for change, and he wanted to be an advocate politically. So that's how he's found his way through to, as you say, be on the Biden administration's very special team there, the environmental and justice part of that team. But the other thing that was really interesting for me was he got there via the 1 million vote program, right? So he found his way in trying to get that 1 million vote program going in the US. Obviously worked very well with that, got an internship with a very inspiring politician there as well, and then made his way through. So not only is it getting young people, more voices of young people at the table, but then allowing them the space to be able to advocate, which is really important.
Absolutely. You know, it's funny, isn't it, that there are so many reasons right now, perhaps more than in any other time in recent history, to be pessimistic about the state of the world, to think, you know what, we are facing what we hope is the back end of this pandemic, but still clearly millions of people being terribly affected by COVID-19. We have a climate crisis for which we're yet to find any long-term solutions, although we're endeavouring to make progress on that front. But then when you see people like Jerome, you know, you see young leaders like Jerome, not even 20 years old, you think, you know what, actually maybe things aren't quite as bad as they might appear. Maybe there are, alongside the reasons for pessimism, some real reasons for optimism as well, because once the world is being led by people like Jerome Foster, you can only imagine what we will achieve. Absolutely. You took the word out of my mouth, actually, was optimism, right? The sense of optimism that he has. It also actually motivated me to want to go home and have a chat with my 22-year-old, to follow in Jerome's footsteps. But yeah, you're right, optimism. I think the other thing was he's also passionate about trying to learn more. So as you say, he went out and has talked to a lot of people. As he said, he's gone out to Indigenous communities to talk to Indigenous communities, and he talked about the fact that he is working with Indigenous communities, coming to the table and finding Indigenous solutions to some of the issues that he talked about, like the California fires and how they use controlled burns for years. And this is something that we've seen in other Indigenous communities across Australia, and those conversations have been happening in New Zealand as well about the Indigenous solutions to some of these massive climate issues that we have. I just find myself consistently wanting to take my hat off to him, you know, and say, yours, yeah, that's just, you're the man. And consistently wanting to compare him to your son and to yourself, yes, it certainly makes you feel like you've been sitting on your backside a bit long when you start comparing yourself with someone as inspiring as Jerome Foster.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. As I say, we're getting comments coming in as well, so keep those comments coming in as well. We're going now to go to our next panel discussion coming up shortly. Ōrākei will be joined by 3 guests to discuss the Indigenous economy.
E te ti, e te tā, no mai haere mai. To everyone from here and there, welcome. As Indigenous people navigate another period of great uncertainty, we embrace our ancestral knowledge to reimagine what success looks like. We look back at our traditional values, the things that bind us together as Indigenous peoples, shaping our communities through our Indigenous values and striving for influence over our lands and natural resources, drawing on our strengths to thrive in the world before us. Our shared connectedness and indigeneity, along with our connection to the land, water, sky, and spirit. Rekindling our trading heritage, igniting our entrepreneurial spirit, and realizing the potential of Indigenous businesses to deliver to the Asia-Pacific region. Our intergenerational focus and commitment to collective well-being is a catalyst for mutual benefit for trade and economic prosperity for our communities around the globe. Overcoming economic shocks and embracing new technologies. Our ability to adapt to these ever-changing environments is a testament to our resilience and strength. Drawing together as Indigenous brothers and sisters to be a stronger voice in the Asia-Pacific region and the world. Unite, together, as only together can we do this for all Indigenous peoples. Mai te kore, ki te pō, ki te ao marama. From potential to thought to consciousness. Creating further change together.
Hui hui a mai anoi te iwi. Indigenous economic growth. It's an integral part of the region's inclusive growth and prosperity. Now the APEC region, as we've learned over the course of this two-day broadcast, is home to 270 million Indigenous people. COVID-19 has had a significant and disproportionate economic impact on the Indigenous community across the region. It is my honour to welcome and to host and also to be in the company of esteemed guests right now. Three mana wahine, our final panel for the APEC 2021 CEO Summit here. And of course it consists of te upoko of Ngāti Whātua Whaimaia, Ngāti Whātua ki Ōrākei Whaimaia CEO, Chief Executive Rangimari e Hunia, tēnā rawatu koe te mare kura. And across over in Canada we have Tabitha Bull, President and CEO at the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and lastly, thirdly, our wonderful Crystal Kinsella, Director of Indigenous Professional Services based in Australia. Nau mai, rarau mai e ngā wahine. Women of influence, women of great mana, and of course Indigenous. Firstly, tīmata ke kia koe te mare kura. Let's look at, firstly, it's been a challenge for the last 2 years, especially for iwi, but particularly for Ngāti Whātua being based here in the Auckland CBD. Tell us about what are some of the challenges you've been up against in during the pandemic.
Pai, tuatahi ake rā, ka tukuna ngā mihi ki ngā iwi taku o te ao, anei rā te mihi o Ngāti Whātua ki a koutou katoa e whakarongo mai ana I tēnei ahi. Kia ora everybody, and it's a privilege and honour to be in this discussion today. We're in the middle of what I would call a contemporary battlefield here in Tāmaki Makaurau. COVID-19 and this Delta variant is destroying our communities, and it's rough, it's hard, and I suppose today I've just come out of what I call the trenches. My team are in the trenches. There's 150 of us that are out in streets and doing mobile vaccinations, doing testing, supporting families that are positive. We've also got teams dedicated to providing kai or food and sustenance to our communities. Māori communities suffering here in Tāmaki, and I'm sure it's an Indigenous experience that has been felt through millions, and so I really want to acknowledge all of those people that are in what I call the front line of this battlefield. Gratitude and hope that your people are safe and they're well.
How would you describe, before I pass this question on to our other two guests, but just briefly, how would you describe Indigenous leadership?
I think the beauty about Indigenous leadership is that it's simple in my view. It puts culture at the centre of everything that you do. So it crafts the way that you approach life. It also simplifies how you do things by taking your values, taking your culture and driving that all the way through. And I think about this in the way we had a hui with our team, and they said you strip away the here and get down to the nako. Whakapapa becomes critical, reo and culture becomes critical, saving lives becomes critical, and doing it with kindness in our way and our style becomes critically important, and that's what I think we've had to do here in the middle of Tāmaki.
Kia ora. Crystal, I see you nodding there on the screen behind us. Clearly you're in agreement with Rangimari's sentiment about how she describes Indigenous leadership. Can you share your thoughts?
I can, thank you. Very much, I feel exactly the same way as has been expressed. We're all about reciprocity, and it's about mutual respect, mutual benefit, and it's about a collective versus the individual. And so, that's a very big part about how we operate in business. It's about our community, it's about our people, and making sure that we're all taking that journey forward.
And Tabitha, your thoughts on the state of Indigenous economy at the moment, given the pandemic is a global issue?
Yeah, thank you. Ani, Tabitha Indigenous Cosnipsi Indigenous Bath. Pleasure to be here from Canada, Turtle Island, and so incredible to hear, the words and to understand how close we all are, even though we're so far apart. So, we Indigenous as Anishinaabe, which I am, we have the 7 grandfather teachings, which talks about honesty and trust and humility and love. And we've really seen that in Indigenous business and the Indigenous economy over the last 20 months. Similarly, we've seen really a different impact on Indigenous business here in Canada than others across. And through our surveys, though, one thing that's really stuck out, and particularly with women-owned businesses, is even though this pandemic has been so hard on small, medium enterprises, over 30% of those have created some new business line in which they're able to support communities. And that might be through providing PPE or supporting community with transportation. But even when, everything feels against you, these businesses are still finding ways to give back to their community. And I think that is so indicative of our culture and why we're in business in the first place.
Is that what makes Indigenous business unique? Is that the community is first, and while there is drive to, not so much drive, but there is a focus on raising the economies of the communities around you, but actually giving back. Is that what does make Indigenous business unique?
I think Indigenous people have values and approaches that are ancient, and when we start to be in the game of business, we take those values and we apply them for the long term, not the short. And so when I hear things like planet over profit, that has been our way of doing since time immemorial. I think the other thing is that things like COVID, you get to the heart of what's important, and there is a resilience in and amongst Indigenous people. And I think of our Māori people, and I think about iwi, hapu and marae. They have shown that, they have done that, and they do that day in, day out. It just is something that's entrenched in our DNA to be able to give in service to the kaupapa of others. And that's what makes Indigenous business prosper. And I think the opportunity here, when I look at the theme of looking at the future, what APEC has the ability to do is actually to embrace an Indigenous worldview and approaches, take the brand of Indigenous people respectfully, honourably and and together, but also to celebrate that way of being, the way of the future. Because to be frank, the state of this nation, the state of the world needs a different way, and I think Indigenous peoples have the solutions.
Yes, and that was resonated and actually articulated very well also by Dr. David Suzuki earlier in our broadcast. But how do we get, Tabitha, let's start with you, how do we get, rather than pull Indigenous peoples or Indigenous leaders like yourselves to the table to talk directly to government, the other way around? Shouldn't it be government and business leaders coming to Indigenous? How do we bridge that gap where, we're kind of at the back end and waiting for our turn? How do we flip the script and bring government and leaders, CEOs to the table and actually approaching Māori or Indigenous communities instead of the other way around?
Yeah, here in Canada, so this is definitely one thing we saw when the COVID business supports were rolled out. A number of the business supports, Indigenous businesses, specifically those in Canada who lived on reserve, were not able to apply. And we have been pushing for the last 20 months saying, we cannot be an afterthought. Indigenous business and how Indigenous businesses are structured needs to be at the beginning of every program rollout. And one thing I think that's going to make that difference is that every organization within the government needs to look at their programs and ensuring that Indigenous businesses have not just the opportunity to apply, but that the outcomes include them. In Canada, it often goes to what would be our Indigenous Services Ministry instead of something that's the responsibility of every ministry. And then in terms of procurement, we've recently had an announcement mandating 5% procurement from Indigenous businesses within government, but that's also within every ministry, and they're going to be required to publicly report. we're also pushing for that to be tied to performance and performance pay of ministers within the government. I know we're behind Australia on that, so we're trying to quickly catch up there. But it really needs to be tied to performance and performance pay, and needs to be publicly reported.
Speaking of Australia, Crystal, what are the challenges that you and your associates, Indigenous associates or business colleagues over in Australia, are coming up against?
Our sector here has grown so incredibly since the introduction of the Indigenous procurement policy here in Australia in 2015, and our government has spent $5.3 billion with Indigenous businesses. So there's still a great aspiration to do business with us. There's a driving demand, but we still need to see the supply and support around that supply. So we have a lot of Indigenous businesses that are small or small enterprises. We need support around the growth and the capability development to be able to reach and scaffold to much larger opportunities. There's still a lot of unconscious bias that does exist when people think of an Indigenous person in business, and we still have a really long way to go in really demystifying that what's seen in the media or about Indigenous people, but they actually see us as really successful Indigenous business leaders. We've been practicing, business and entrepreneurship for more than 60,000 years. We were the first inventors and traders, and I think that needs to be recognised, and the dialogue needs to change around that.
Rangi Marie, let's discuss how Indigenous groups, governments and businesses can work together. What are some of the solutions, I suppose, that Ngāti Whātua ki Ōrākei have already implemented that are actually success drivers?
I think at a micro level, and when I think about a micro level, what we know is that over successive generations we are more empowered, we are more skilled, and our economy is taking off. And so when I think about how you bring it closer, we have a strong sense of what I would call mana motuhake, self-determination to make our own calls in our own way in our own time. And right now, COVID is telling us we don't wait, we just go. And I would hope what I'm seeing on the ground is that we have developed what I call in Māori hoapumo. And those hoapumo are people that come in and support. They don't lead. We've got to lead. That's the Indigenous way. That's what we have to do in times of resilience, in times of struggle, in times of crisis. We've got to go out and we've got to bring a coalition of the willing together. And I think I'm seeing so many beautiful examples of that. Like on the weekend, we had a big, what we call Ira Dot. And so that's the idea of changing the narrative around vaccinations to something that is normal, that is accessible, that makes sense for rangatahi. So when I see this young man on screen talking about the way in which rangatahi lead out, that's where we've got to in terms of our vaccination program. We called it Ira Dot, get your dot your lot, join the dots, connect the dots, language I don't know. And they even use things called social media, I don't know that either. But what we did is we gave our young people the freedom to have a discussion about stuff that matters in their way, in their space, and we've got to go in behind us. And I think the thing is about that is that we use that model in our way, that we have a discussion with the Crown. There's the kaupapa, you get in behind the kaupapa, you support the kaupapa, and then you bring in that coalition. I'd also like to say that what's been really humbling in times like this is the way that the private sector has got in behind, particularly Ngāti Whātua and Māori health providers across Tāmaki, to have a crack at changing the circumstance that we're in. Now, would that have occurred maybe 6 months ago? Probably not.
Tell me, why is that? Why suddenly 6 months on, well, 6 months ago, private institutions are backing Ngāti Whātua or iwi, or people who are pushing at the front line? I
think kaupapa or purpose means everything, and so what we came up with was the purpose of Tāmaki tūkotahi. Tāmaki needs to stand together, Tāmaki needs to find its own solutions, Tāmaki needs to also embrace everybody to get there. It needs to be Māori led and it needs to be supported by all. No clever CEO would say no to that, in my view. And that's what we saw over the weekend, that's what we've seen over the last couple of months, and I think it's that kind of leadership that gets us out of the situation we're in, which has seen 90% of Tāmaki having their first dot. So we see now an unlocking of freedoms that our people are desperate for. And I think the other part too is there's a real understanding that the way that we do things is what is required at a time like this, which means we are there for everybody and we make sure that our actions, we walk the talk. I mean, that's when I talk about the trenches, it's real. And I think people can see that, they respect that, and they come in beside that.
Yes, I want to go back to you, Crystal. In terms of the response and the response from the Indigenous communities over in Australia, what are you seeing on the ground there in terms of the COVID pandemic and, you know, just building the bridges and ensuring that your own communities are safeguarded first and foremost from a real deadly disease, but also driving forward, you know, hope for a future?
Yeah, look, it's been a really mixed response on the ground. After last year, a lot of people thought, oh, Indigenous people in Australia had, you know, were doing the best off in regards to, you know, we didn't have any cases of Indigenous people having COVID. And then this year, you know, with the Delta stream, it had a very severe and devastating impact, and it really demonstrated how tough our remote and rural and regional communities are suffering. Mobile homes had to be taken out to a little place called Wilcannia, where nearly the whole town of 600 people contracted COVID. You know, there were Indigenous people that were sleeping in tents in their front yards because they had nowhere to isolate away from other family members. So it really highlighted, you know, the disadvantage and the difference. There's still, you know, there's a lot of people taking up the vaccine, but then there's still a lot of people that have indifference to government authority, and they don't see that they're having a choice in taking up the vaccine. So it's definitely had some, you know, real impacts, and I think it's really quite divided the nation here, and not just on COVID for us as a country, but we went through bushfires and floods last year, and then, you know, to be compounded with you know, a global pandemic. People are still trying to survive and get things back up running again, particularly our Indigenous businesses.
Tēnā koe, I'm mindful of the time running away with us, and there's plenty more to discuss, no doubt. The time's too short. But Tabitha, just letting you in here, and what is pressing on your heart in terms of what you'd like to get across to the APEC leaders and everyone watching and joining in on this summit this year?
Thanks. You know, I think it's similar to say that there is this unconscious bias out there about what businesses, Indigenous businesses, what sectors they're in. And here in Canada, we're seeing Indigenous businesses being created 9 times the rate of non-Indigenous businesses, and they are in every sector, in every size. They are major businesses that are supporting large corporations and doing good work for large corporations. And we've actually seen a real high propensity to trade and export. So we did a recent study that showed that Canadian Indigenous businesses were twice as likely to have the propensity and interest in exporting. And I think that's something that is really important for the leaders that are listening today, to know that Canadian Indigenous businesses are growing, they're resilient, and they're looking to trade and looking to make partnerships across the globe.
Tangi Mārie o kupu ki te hunga e mātakitaki ana. Hea tau ki a rātou.
I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to share an Indigenous voice among these beautiful women that have graced our stage today. I think there is one message, and that is that Indigenous people have the answers for the solutions for the future, and we've got to invest in that, support that, and lean into that, and I'm keen to be a part of that future.
Kia ora, tēnā koe. And lastly, to you, Crystal, I see here you believe that there is an importance of storytelling in leadership, but I'll give you the final words to those who are watching. What is your message to all our guests out there?
I just think storytelling is a great way to get a message across and empower people, inspire people. And it's a practice that has sat with us culturally for generations and generations. It's how I grew up, and I think it's a really big part of being a leader, to share story. You know, there's a power in a narrative that can resonate and connect and bring people together. And I think, you know, for all that are watching, it should be something you have in your toolbox. Yeah.
Tēnā rawa atu koe. O tira tēnā koutou e ngā wāhine, e ngā kai urungi o koutou waka i ngā iwi huhua o te ao. Thank you so much for joining us. Back over to you, Jack and Julian.
Tēnā koe Horini, e ki ana te kōrero, mea ro ki te hā o hinea huone, nā reira mihi ana ki te manawahine. I whakatere ake ngā kōrero, hei aha he aronga mai ma te tini tangata, the power of the manawahine hoa, the power of wahine toa, but also Indigenous solutions for global issues, a real key point that's been made, and the fact that also a really interesting point I heard from, I think it was Tabitha, about the growth rate, the developing rate of Indigenous businesses in Canada, 9 times the rate of non-Indigenous businesses and twice the likelihood or double the likelihood of wanting to trade externally, internationally.
Extraordinary, yeah. As an Indigenous leader yourself, do you feel like you see that progress?
I wouldn't say I'm an Indigenous leader, but certainly supportive of Indigenous leaders. No, absolutely. So you heard about the procurement rate in Australia, the procurement policy in Australia, $5 billion of procurement into Indigenous businesses in Australia. So Ōrākei is a well-known kaupapa now that's expanded out of South Auckland, across Auckland and the North Island now. That's something that is a procurement policy for Māori business, for Indigenous business here in New Zealand. Yes, it's, the Indigenous communities are working together a lot more on issues like that, but we are also seeing Indigenous organisations, Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei being one of them, who are willing to let go of the reins of power to rangatahi, to young people, which is something being progressively adapted across many other Indigenous communities.
Koe nā te kōrero. Right, since we're going to be talking about the future, we want to hand over now to Maya to introduce this next section.
Coming up next, we are going to hear from our next generation of leaders. First, we have a short video featuring some of New Zealand's upcoming business leaders. They will share with us their vision of the future and tell us what we should be thinking about in order to get there. Following that, we will hear from 2 of the participants in the APEC Voices of the Future program. Over the past month, they have been working with young leaders from across the APEC region on the big issues that matter to them. They are, after all, the biggest stakeholders in the work that APEC is doing.
Every single day, technology is empowering organizations to unlock new value. It's brought us here together today. It is also an opportunity to build meaningful partnerships with ministries and organizations that are closer to the community and can provide opportunities to digitally upskill and reskill.
We've seen these global movements of Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Indigenous Land Back. I hope that people understand that these are all just a glimpse into what will be minimum expectations of our future generations.
As a young mama, my vision is for a future where my tamariki or my children have every opportunity available to them to thrive as unapologetically Māori or Indigenous.
I think leaders should be most concerned about the effects that social media has on the mental health of our younger generation today.
As we adapt and recover, we must look outwards. Greater cooperation and connection across businesses, sectors and markets will be essential for supporting the economic recovery and more robust supply chains going forward.
Leaders need to be thinking about the impact that they're having to drive equitable outcomes for our communities and for our Indigenous communities. Transforming in a way that's going to have a positive impact on the social, the emotional, the physical and the spiritual well-being of our communities and the people that live within them, not only for today, but for future generations to come.
My vision for the future is one where all APEC members recognise that we are stronger when we are better connected. Our APEC region was built on trade, and deepening trade relationships for both goods and services will drive us to a more resilient future.
My vision for the future is a proud and kind Aotearoa for all. Proud of who we are as a country, kind to one another, and also unapologetically us, for those of the word to see who we are as people.
No te roro, naku te roro, ka ora ai te iwi. With your food basket and my food basket, the people will thrive. By working together in community, we can all flourish. I'm Sophie, a delegate for Aotearoa New Zealand as part of this year's Voices of the Future. Throughout these last few weeks, I have been feeling the huge honour and responsibility that's come from being a part of this Voices community we've created online. 124 young people from across the 21 economies have been embracing, connecting and collaborating virtually to draft a youth declaration. We have brought our baskets to the table across time zones, grounded in our various contexts and cultures to create a shared vision for our economies, where we see people and the planet being able to thrive. We have celebrated our differences and also the values that unite us. We've explored 4 key themes centred around the biggest challenges, aka opportunities, in our midst right now. Through drafting sessions, we heard perspectives from various economy speakers, delegation spokespeople and lead drafters, who then consolidated the ideas heard and understood. Visionary energy, sense of possibility, deep understanding and hope shone through from young people across the region as we developed this declaration together. We need all of these things if we are going to meet this rising tide of both challenge and opportunity. It's become crystal clear to us, and I hope to you too, that young people are not just the voices of the future, but of today. So it's time we all bring our baskets to the same table, across generations, to create a vision for a future of our region which will last generations, which will transcend those of us living right now. We believe an example can be taken from our ability to work as one team. We have joined, worked and grown together, all bringing our own perspectives but on the same boat and paddling in the same direction. The result of this is a youth declaration that we are proud of, which communicates the interconnectedness of our planet, our people and our economy, and which demonstrates the potential for better. We are so excited to share this with you now.
1 billion young people make up a third of APEC's population. We put forward this declaration, our voices of our generation, demanding accountability and actions from leaders today. I'm Liwei, and I was a delegate for Aotearoa New Zealand in this year's Future program. He waka eke noa, we're all in this together. This is a turning point. We urge APEC leaders to focus on education that will build a resilient economy of the future for the future. To us, this looks like investing in accessible quality education systems and large-scale digitalisation that develops future-ready skills, through focusing on enhancing digital capability and educating on sustainability and Indigenous knowledge. We are nurturing future generations that are innovative, adaptive and global citizens. We urge APEC leaders to prioritise equitable outcomes for all. To ensure this happens, we must recognise and address the inequities that exist and that has been exacerbated by COVID-19, the climate crisis and worsening social disparities. Voices of those most affected must be front and centre in decision-making and policy development. This includes youth, women, Indigenous communities and other marginalised groups. Equal access to education, health and digital connectivity all require investment if we are to truly see equitable outcomes. We urge APEC leaders to centre well-being. For this to be meaningful, a focus should be on economic, social and environmental well-being. Measuring what matters will support APEC in encompassing this in their conversation and work. We must divest from fossil fuels. We must invest in actualising climate justice on mental wellness initiatives, leveraging modern technology solutions within our young people. This is the moment for us to be charting a path together to a better future, a reality we can feel proud to pass on. Now you have heard the voices of the future. We have been bold. We call on you to do the same. Are you listening?
I certainly hope so. Some incredible, powerful words there from rangatahi around New Zealand and around the world. Young people, the future leaders of tomorrow. And like I say, at a time when we have many, many reasons to feel pessimistic about the state of the world, you only need to hear some of those messages and consider some of the passion on display there to feel a little more optimistic about the future that awaits us.
Absolutely. I felt quite emboldened, I felt quite invigorated by that presentation. And I want to thank those rangatahi, those young people, for taking that call to action. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa.
To introduce our final APEC economy leader, Prime Minister of Thailand, His Excellency General Prayut, we're about to hand over to Dr. Rebecca Sta Maria. Rebecca is the Executive Director of the APEC Secretariat based in Singapore, where she advises and provides support for APEC's 21 diverse member economies.
Just prior to that introduction, we have a short video to watch on the APEC App Challenge, an established activity incorporated into APEC's annual calendar. Now, every year, this activity encourages young software developers from all APEC economies to develop digital solutions for cross-cutting challenges for the region. A group of App Challenge alumni has organised the establishment of the Digital Makers Asia Pacific, supported by the APEC Secretariat. Secretariat, the Asia Foundation and Google, Digital Makers Asia Pacific aims to become the region's premier community for the region's rangatahi or young people and talented developers.
We are Digital Makers Asia Pacific, or DMAP for short, a group of software developers, designers, entrepreneurs, and innovators. We work together to design digital solutions to the region's many challenges.
We are all from different economies, but we all have one purpose. We all want to build something meaningful for the communities.
We actually built the vaccination software in order to source volunteers out. Turns out very well. We received close to around 10,000 to 20,000 volunteers in vaccination center. DMAP has been helping us by providing technical development, building our vaccination software. We are currently expanding our initiative for volunteers to be able to find events, the thing that we really want to achieve, to open source product or tools that are able to help APEC economies.
DMAP has a very bright future. There are a lot of very talented individuals that make up a collective whole, and the mission, the alignment, the focus that we have means that we can truly move mountains to achieve our goals.
Google, APEC, and the Asia Foundation are working together to launch the Digital Makers Asia Pacific Alumni Network. Through mentorship and dialogue with the DMAP network, it's going to create more opportunities for these leaders of tomorrow.
I'm very excited to see how we can get involved in more projects in APEC and grow our network in Asia Pacific region.
It's been quite a year. 2021 tested our mettle, but under such circumstances, we gained lessons for how we must cooperate with each other as economies and as a region. Earlier this week, our ministers met to advance an economic recovery grounded on containing the pandemic, implementing structural reforms to improve social outcomes and boost human capital development, while ensuring that everyone benefits from digital transformation, protecting the environment, and leveraging regional cooperation to realize an inclusive recovery. Over the last 2 days, the business community and other sectors, and among them the region's presidents and prime ministers, shared views from different perspectives, which will be essential for when leaders meet to decide on APEC's next steps. Nearing the end of their chairing, let me express my gratitude to New Zealand, our host economy, for making this first fully virtual APEC year a time for economies to truly join, work and grow together despite the pandemic. As we have learned the hard way, something is lost without the travel, without the face-to-face conversations and the chance encounters. But the New Zealand team have not only made our virtual meeting spaces hospitable and enjoyable, but they have also paved what in my mind is the best path possible to a sustainable, digitally enabled and inclusive recovery. This recovery will be seen through the next chairing of APEC by Thailand, to which I am looking forward. While we have been living under a global crisis, the region is being steered through it by steady hands. In this way, APEC is between two good places. We expect the transition between APEC 2021 and 2022 to be seamless, with the two chairs sharing a range of priority themes such as digital innovation and protecting the environment. No doubt, this means engaging with a broad set of stakeholders, including youth who inspire us and women who make an enormous impact on the region's economy. APEC 2022 will hopefully be the beginning of a post-pandemic era in which the world will regain its dynamism. While the COVID virus itself will not likely be totally eradicated by then, Thailand will lead the region in navigating a world where it has been diminished. Under their chairing, the region will get to explore new shifting paradigms where the digital economy and sustainable and inclusive growth play a vital role in the way we think about our policies. Most exciting of all, we can look forward to their plans to reboot regional connectivity, particularly in the travel and tourism industry. While Thailand will officially announce the theme and priorities of APEC 2022 after the handover from New Zealand as host of APEC 2021, we will soon be treated to a preview of what will be in store for us in 2022. It is my deepest pleasure to introduce to you the chair of APEC Thailand 2022, His Excellency Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha, who will show us what it's like to look to the future.
ท่านผู้นำเขตเศรษฐกิจเอเปกประธาน APEC และผู้มีเกียรติทุกท่านผมยินดีที่ได้เข้าร่วมการประชุม APEC CEO Summit ในวันนี้และขอแสดงความยินดีกับ APEC New Zealand ที่จัดการประชุมครั้งนี้ได้เป็นอย่างดีปี 2564 เป็นอีกปีที่มีความท้าทายสำหรับ APEC การแพร่ระบาดของโควิด -19 ยังคงส่งผลกระทบอย่างรุนแรงต่อธุรกิจการจ้างงานและชีวิตความเป็นอยู่ของผู้คนในขณะที่โลกพยายามจะฟื้นตัวจากวิกฤตทางเศรษฐกิจสังคมและสุขภาพครั้งที่รุนแรงเป็นประวัติการณ์กรอบความร่วมมือ APEC ที่ถูกจับตามองว่าจะสามารถมีส่วนส่งเสริมความพยายามของประชาคมโลกได้หรือไม่ซึ่งพวกเราก็ได้พิสูจน์ให้เห็นแล้วว่าภายใต้การเป็นเจ้าภาพของนิวซีแลนด์และด้วยจิตวิญญาณแห่งความร่วมมือ APEC สามารถยืนหยัดเอาชนะความท้าทายต่างๆฟื้นฟูการสาธารณสุขเปิดพรมแดนและพลิกฟื้นเศรษฐกิจโดยมีเป้าหมายเพื่อความเป็นอยู่ที่ดีของประชาชนโลกที่เราอยู่อาศัยและความมั่งคั่งร่วมกันตัวอย่างความสำเร็จของ APEC ก็คือความพยายามร่วมกันในการที่จะเพิ่มการเข้าถึงวัคซีนและการอำนวยความสะดวกในการขนส่งวัคซีนและเวชภัณฑ์ซึ่งในประเด็นนี้เราต้องขอขอบคุณการสนับสนุนจากภาคเอกชนด้วยเช่นกันสถานการณ์การแพร่ระบาดยังคงไม่สิ้นสุดในระยะเวลาใกล้นี้แต่เรายังมีเรื่องที่ต้องทำอีกมากเพื่อจะเปลี่ยนผ่านไปสู่ช่วงของการฟื้นฟูเศรษฐกิจและการพลิกโฉมระบบเศรษฐกิจของพวกเรายังคงต้องเผชิญกับความท้าทายในทุกๆด้านทั้งผลกระทบทางเศรษฐกิจและสังคมจากโควิด -19 ไปจนถึงความไม่เท่าเทียมที่ยังลากลึกและความไม่สมดุลในการดำเนินชีวิตตลอดจนการดำเนินธุรกิจและการปฏิสัมพันธ์กับธรรมชาติซึ่งการแพร่ระบาดของโควิดได้ทำให้สิ่งเหล่านี้เลวร้ายลงไปอีกถึงเวลาแล้วที่เราต้องเปลี่ยนทัศนคติไปสู่ความพอดีและพยายามสร้างสังคมหลังการแพร่ระบาดที่มีความยั่งยืนและสมดุลมากยิ่งขึ้นเพื่อประชาชนและโลกของเราเวลานี้เป็นโอกาสที่เราจะเปลี่ยนแปลงการกระทำของเราเพื่ออนาคตที่ดีกว่าเดิมความพยายามดังกล่าวนั้นต้องอาศัยความสามารถในการสร้างสมดุลระหว่างทุกสิ่งด้วยเหตุนี้ประเทศไทยจึงได้นำโมเดลการพัฒนาเศรษฐกิจชีวภาพเศรษฐกิจหมุนเวียนและเศรษฐกิจสีเขียวหรือโมเดลเศรษฐกิจ BCG มาใช้เป็นส่วนหนึ่งของยุทธศาสตร์ชาติในการฟื้นฟูเศรษฐกิจหลังโควิดซึ่งเป็นการผสาน3แนวทางไปสู่ความยั่งยืนเข้าด้วยกันเพื่อมุ่งสู่แนวทางการพัฒนาเป้าหมายทางเศรษฐกิจสิ่งแวดล้อมและสังคมอย่างเป็นองค์รวมและมีความสมดุลมากยิ่งขึ้นและโมเดลนี้จะเป็นเครื่องยนต์ขับเคลื่อนประเด็นสำคัญในการที่จะเป็นเจ้าภาพ APEC ของไทยเรามุ่งมั่นที่จะสานต่อการทำงานที่ผ่านมาของ APEC และเชื่อมโยงกับวิสัยทัศน์ปุตราจารยาคศ 2040 โดยเราจะแปลงวิสัยทัศน์ไปสู่การปฏิบัติผ่านปัจจัยขับเคลื่อนทางเศรษฐกิจ3ประการได้แก่ 1. การค้าและการลงทุน 2. ดิจิทัลและนวัตกรรมและ 3. ความยั่งยืนและการมีส่วนร่วมการรับรองแผนปฏิบัติการของวิสัยทัศน์ปุตราจารยาในคืนนี้จะเป็นความสำเร็จที่สำคัญของนิวซีแลนด์ที่ได้ทำงานหนักตลอดทั้งปีเพื่อการแปลงวิสัยทัศน์ของผู้นำ APEC ไปสู่แผนการทำงาน ที่เป็นรูปธรรมและปฏิบัติได้จริงในปี 2565 ประเทศไทยมุ่งมั่นจะทำให้เอเปกเปิดกว้างสำหรับทุกโอกาสเชื่อมโยงในทุกมิติและสมดุลในทุกด้านวาระการเป็นเจ้าภาพเอเปกของไทยจะสอดคล้องกับเป้าหมายและการดำเนินการที่มีอยู่แล้วของเอเปกแต่นำเสนอภายใต้แนวคิดใหม่ประเด็นสำคัญในการเป็นเจ้าภาพเอเปกของไทยมีอยู่3ประการด้วยกันได้แก่ 1. การอำนวยความสะดวกการค้าและการลงทุน 2. การฟื้นฟูความเชื่อมโยงและ 3. การส่งเสริมการเติบโตที่ยั่งยืนและครอบคลุมผมเชื่อว่าวาระการเป็นเจ้าภาพเอเปกของไทยจะได้สะท้อนข้อเรียกร้องของภาคธุรกิจที่ต้องการให้ฟื้นฟูเศรษฐกิจรวมทั้งทำให้เศรษฐกิจเข้มแข็งขึ้นและมีความยืดหยุ่นมากยิ่งขึ้นเพื่อเราจะได้ฟื้นตัวอย่างรวดเร็วประการแรกไทยจะสานต่องานของเอเปกในการเปิดตลาดผ่านการส่งเสริมระบบการค้าพหุภาคีขณะเดียวกันเราจะใช้โอกาสจากสถานการณ์โควิด -19 พิจารณาแนวทางการหารือใหม่ๆเกี่ยวกับการค้าและการลงทุนของเอเปกในฐานะพลังขับเคลื่อนสิ่งดีๆที่สะท้อนความต้องการและผลประโยชน์ที่เปลี่ยนแปลงไปของภาคธุรกิจและผู้มีส่วนร่วมในวงกว้างไทยจะพยายามอย่างเต็มที่ในการฟื้นการหารือเรื่องการจัดทำเขตการค้าเสรีในเอเชียแปซิฟิกหรือ FTAP หลังยุคโควิดเพื่อส่งเสริมการรวมตัวทางเศรษฐกิจในภูมิภาครวมไปถึงการใช้ประโยชน์จากการเปลี่ยนแปลงไปสู่ดิจิทัลและการรับมือกับประเด็นทางการค้าใหม่ๆเช่นการเปลี่ยนแปลงสภาพภูมิอากาศสาธารณสุขและการพัฒนาที่ครอบคลุมซึ่งไทยหวังว่าจะได้ทำงานอย่างแข็งขันร่วมกับภาคเอกชนในเรื่องนี้ประการที่ 2ในการที่จะอำนวยความสะดวกด้านการค้าและการลงทุนได้นั้นภูมิภาคจะต้องกลับมาเชื่อมโยงกันอีกครั้งเราจึงให้ความสำคัญกับการฟื้นฟูการเดินทางข้ามพรมแดนที่ปลอดภัยและไร้รอยต่อซึ่งไทยมุ่งมั่นที่จะเชื่อมโยงภูมิภาคโดยการเปิดพรมแดนอีกครั้งโดยตั้งแต่เมื่อวันที่ 1 พฤศจิกายนไทยได้เปิดประเทศเพื่อรับนักเดินทางทางอากาศจาก 63 ประเทศและอาณาเขตซึ่งเขตเศรษฐกิจเอเปกส่วนใหญ่ก็รวมอยู่ด้วยและเรามีแผนจะขยายจำนวนต่อไปอีกความคืบหน้าในการเชื่อมโยงภูมิภาคมีความสำคัญต่อเส้นทางสู่การฟื้นตัวทางเศรษฐกิจของเอเปกดังนั้นเราจึงเลือกความเชื่อมโยงให้เป็นหนึ่งในประเด็นสำคัญที่ไทยจะผลักดันในปีหน้าเราจะดำเนินการตามคำแนะนำของ APEC ในการจัดตั้งคณะทำงานด้านการเดินทางอย่างปลอดภัยเพื่อร่วมมือกันเชื่อมโยงภูมิภาคเข้าด้วยกันอีกครั้งจากนี้ไป APEC จำเป็นต้องเชื่อมโยงกันให้มากขึ้นและในระยะยาวควรใช้ประโยชน์จากนวัตกรรมและเทคโนโลยีเพื่ออำนวยความสะดวกต่อการเคลื่อนย้ายข้ามพรมแดนในกลุ่มสมาชิก APEC เพื่อให้มั่นใจว่าการเคลื่อนย้ายสินค้าบริการและผู้คนจะเป็นไปอย่างมีประสิทธิภาพประการที่ 3ขณะที่เรากำลังฟื้นฟูจากการแพร่ระบาดของโควิด -19 ไทยยืนยันว่าการเติบโตทางเศรษฐกิจของ APEC จะครอบคลุมและยั่งยืนโดยในที่ประชุม COP26 เมื่อสัปดาห์ที่ผ่านมาผู้นำประเทศต่างๆก็ได้ยืนยันความมุ่งมั่นร่วมกันเพื่อนำไปสู่การสร้างความยั่งยืนและการมีสภาพภูมิอากาศที่ดีประเทศไทยจะศึกษาโมเดลทางเศรษฐกิจและการดำเนินการทางเศรษฐกิจต่างๆรวมถึงโมเดลเศรษฐกิจ BCG ซึ่งให้ความสำคัญกับการจัดการการเปลี่ยนแปลงสภาพภูมิอากาศและความท้าทายด้านสิ่งแวดล้อมในภูมิภาคควบคู่ไปกับการเติบโตทางเศรษฐกิจที่แข็งแกร่งและยืดหยุ่นขณะเดียวกันไทยก็จะให้ความสำคัญกับการมีส่วนร่วมของทุกภาคส่วนรวมถึงการกระจายผลประโยชน์อย่างเท่าเทียมไปยังประชาชนและภาคธุรกิจทั้งหมดของเราภายใต้แนวคิดเศรษฐกิจ BCG และประเด็นสำคัญ3ประเด็นภายใต้การเป็นเจ้าภาพเอเปกของไทยผมขอเชิญชวนทุกท่านให้ร่วมกันทำงานอย่างเต็มที่และดำเนินการในทันทีเพื่ออนาคตที่รุ่งเรืองยั่งยืนและมีความสมดุลของพวกเราไทยยืนยันว่าประเด็นสำคัญของเราจะสานต่องานของเอเปก และมอบมุมมองใหม่ต่อประเด็นอื่นๆที่เกี่ยวข้องโดยเฉพาะในบริบทของโลกหลังโควิดเอเปกต้องคงความยืดหยุ่นและความเชื่อมโยงกับผู้คนและธุรกิจต่างๆของเราผมตั้งตารอที่จะหารือเรื่องนี้ต่อไปในเดือนพฤศจิกายนปีหน้าขอบคุณครับ
E poutu māro tonu ana a tamanui te rā ki runga ki a mātau I tāmaki makaura o tira ki a mātau I konei Aotearoa hoi anō kua toringi te rā ki runga ki tēnei kaupapa nui whakaharahara e kia nei ko APEC CEO Summit 2021. What I'm saying, everyone, is it is almost time for the summit close. But before that, we would like to see someone who we haven't seen for quite some time now, eh, Julian?
She's been very supportive of you and I and Jack. She's been very supportive.
Yes, absolutely. And we're talking about Maya. Maya, you've just about finished your job as the first ever digital host of the APEC CEO Summit. How has it gone for you?
I have so enjoyed hosting alongside you these past few days. I feel like I have learnt so much from all of our amazing speakers and everyone online. I can't believe my time with you is almost over. Interacting with everyone watching the summit has been a real highlight for me.
E hoa e mā punana te turanga hakoa iau mahi, nā reira ka nui te mihi ki a koe. Thank you so much, Maya, for all your work as well. I feel like the past 2 days have gone by so quickly. We have covered a heck of a lot of ground at the APEC Summit 2021. And thank you all so much for joining us on the platform from across the APEC region. We hope you've got a lot out of today and also our 2-day APEC CEO Summit. We'd like to once again thank our premier partners for helping to make this year's summit possible. So thank you very much to PwC, the knowledge partner of the 2021 APEC CEO Summit, and joined by additional premier partners, Contact Energy, Fonterra, Microsoft and Westpac New Zealand. Thank you so very much. Thank you also to our international media partners, Bloomberg, Time and CNBC. Thank you very much.
Tēnā rawatu koutou katoa o tira. E mihi nei te ngākau kia koutou on behalf of myself, actually, on behalf of Julian and I. He, of course, can end his own kōrero. E mihi tēnei kia koutou. It's been an honour to sit as a co-host of the summit alongside Julian and to deliver the kōrero from here, Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland. Nō reira, hei whakakapi e nei kōrero, kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa pounamu te moana, kia tere te kārohirohi.
Tēnā koe. May the seas before you all be calm. May they glisten like greenstone. And may the simmer of Shama dance across your pathways for the raumati. Te raumati o Tūranga Hakoa. May it dance across your pathway now and forevermore.
Kia ora kōrua. He rawe tā kōrua mahi. Great job, Ōrākei and Julian. Remember, you will be able to continue to access the CEO Summit platform for the rest of this month, or to watch or re-watch anything that has happened. Also, make sure you take advantage of the networking capabilities and connect with delegates from across the region. And while the summit is coming to a close, at 7 p.m. tonight in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have 2 further panels. One looking back at what we've learned over the last few days, and one that asks what's next for Aotearoa, New Zealand. You know, at a time of great global uncertainty, at a time when the human impulse is to feel more disconnected than ever, what a pleasure and privilege it has been to participate in an event that does quite the opposite, that connects us, that allows us to make connections across the oceans, across the Asia-Pacific region, and across the world. Thank you so much for your participation. It is now my great pleasure to welcome back the 2021 APEC CEO Summit Chair, Barbara Chapman, for her closing address ahead of our formal close by Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Jack. And kia ora. Wow, what a fantastic event. Thank you so much to all our speakers, panellists and world leaders. And a special thank you to our presenters, Ōrākei, Julian, Jack and Maya. Next year, Thailand takes over as the chair of APEC, and we very much look forward to the possibility of a CEO summit where delegates may once again be able to meet in person. Shortly, we will hear from Dr. Po, who is the Thailand APEC CEO Summit chair. Welcome to you, Dr. Po. But before that happens, it is my honour to bring our formal proceedings to a close. This has been a truly compelling 2 days of content, of innovative and thought-provoking ideas and important connections, with the key takeaway for me being that fit for the future means a social-centred recovery, a people-centred recovery, and a planet-centred recovery. Success in a post-COVID world will be defined by an intersection of these three ideals, which benefits everyone in the Asia-Pacific region and further afield more evenly. The APEC CEO Summit is a vital and powerful forum for business leaders, economy leaders, and other organisations across the Asia-Pacific region. As the past year has amply demonstrated, we need these cross-border and intergovernmental organisations and exchanges now more than ever. And we have proven their value once again as we joined together to combat COVID-19 and all its attendant challenges. The past 2 years and this summit have demonstrated the need for and value of business and government working in partnership. As we say farewell from New Zealand, I would like once again to acknowledge and thank my fellow CEO Summit committee members for their efforts on your behalf throughout our hosting year. And in particular, I'd like to thank APEC CEO Summit Executive Director Jonathan Alva and all of his team and the many people and organisations in New Zealand and around the world who have made this virtual summit possible. Thank you also to PwC, our knowledge partner for the APEC CEO Summit, and to our premier partners, Contact Energy, Fonterra, Microsoft, and Westpac New Zealand. Without your support, this event would not have been possible. And thanks again to our international media partners, Bloomberg, Time, and CNBC. The theme for APEC 2021 has been Join, Work, and Grow Together. Haumie, Huie, Taikie. And I sincerely hope that you, like me, have joined in, learned, and been inspired by these past 2 days. Ngā mihi nui, and haere rā from New Zealand, and over to you, Thailand.
Sawadee krap. I am Port Aramwattananont. I am most delighted to have the great opportunity to greet you today as the chair of APEC CEO Summit 2022. And also a great honor for me to invite all of you to APEC CEO Summit 2022 in Thailand. The APEC CEO Summit serves as an important platform for high-level business leaders, entrepreneurs, thinkers to meet and engage with the global leaders, policy and decision makers to deliberate on issues that are pertinent and pressing to our economies, people, and environment. For the coming year, strengthening international cooperation and partnerships is the key to recover when the pandemic is contained and the world is returning to normal. Rethinking and redoing how we trade, deal, and live must be revitalized for all stakeholders. On behalf of Team Thailand, we very much look forward to warmly welcome all of you to the summit next year in the Land of Smiles. Further detail about this event will be available via the APEC CEO Summit Active channel. See you all at the APEC CEO Summit next year here in Thailand. Thank you very much. ขอบคุณและสวัสดีครับ
Tapa tu ki te rangi whakae e kauana. Kai runga te kutipu, kai raro te kuti hono. Kai kona koutou ngā mātua ngā tūpuna mihi mai ai, tangi mai ai a kaumau te hono. Whiti tua, whiti ara. Rānea te rangi e tui honei, te papa e takoto ake nei, ngā tūpuna maunga e tūtū mai nei. E papuri nei ki te himana tapu o tawhito nuku o tawhito rangi. O koutou manawa ki o mātou manawa. Tāne ka iri hia, uhi, wero, tau mai te mauri a haumi e hui e, tai ki e. E kei aku niho nui, kei aku niho roa. Kei tēnā pito o te ao, kei tēnā pito o te ao. Tēnei anō, te puru o tāmaki ki Ngāti Whātua. E tukuna te mihi mai oha ki a koutou. ia koutou e pupuri nei ki ta mauri o ta tātou nei wānanga I roto I ngā rā e rua nei. E tika ana ka mihi atu ki a koutou e aku ringa raupā, e aku ringa rehe, koutou e haka tutuki, ngā mahi, ngā ahuatanga katoa muri, kia tuai tā tātou nei wānanga I runga I te pai I roto I ngā rā nei. E aku mana nui, aku tapu nui, ko oti katoa ngā kōrero mo tā tātou nei hui. Hoi anō me huri tātou ki te hoi, kia mahi a te mahi. Nā reira, ka waiho mā te wāhingaro, e tohu hei arahina I a koutou, kia tutuki ai ngā wapatanga moi moia kei roto I a tātou, kia puta mai he hua, mā rātou mā, mā koutou, mā mātou, ara, mā tātou katoa. Ka waihotia, tēnei kōrero kei raro I te mana o tēnei whakatau ki tuku iho no ngā mātua ngā tūpuna. Unuhia te rito te harakeke, kai hea te kōmako e kō. Whakatairangi tia, rere ki uta, rere ki tai, ki mai koe ki au, he aha te mea nui o tēnei ao māku e ki atu. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata.
Pāpaki mai,
Pāpaki mai,
ngā ngaru nunui,
ngā ngaru nunui,
wāwaratia,
wāwaratia,
ngā tairere,
ngā tairere,
e ripoe,
ngā
ngaru nunui,
ngā ngaru nunui,
tere hutai, hei konei rā.
A tērā kōrero waihotia mai e rātou ngā mātua ngā tūpuna, piti hono, tātai hono, mā te wahine, mā te whenua ka mate te tangata, piti hono, tātai hono, ko te kai o te tangata he toto, ko te oranga o te tangata he whenua, kei aku rangatira mākoha nui tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa.
Piki a kai tā whaki ki te rangi tuatahi, hākina ki te rangi tuarua, he auru te raua tā whaki, ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao. Tēnei te mauri o runga o maunga kie, te tūne, te topa nei ki ngā taumata. Ka tauha ko te rangi e tūne, ka tauha